Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a video series and podcast series about designing better miniature games. We are a pair of game designers. My name's Mike, his name's Glenn.
Hello.
And on this episode, in this conversation, we want to talk about a question that we got from, I believe, one of our viewers on YouTube. And the question was, how do we approach modeling damage in miniature games? And this is, I think it's a super interesting question. I think there's a fair amount of like crunch and fun engineering questions that come out of this.
Engineering.
Fungineering, sure, why not? So I think let's have a little tackle of modeling damage in miniature games. So straight off the bat, I think there's a few elements that we can end up meandering through. One is, and I'm going to ignore the like combat system part of this. I'm not sure how damage gets applied in your game, but once it has been applied, how are we recording it? How much can we take? Is there a degradation mechanic? Is there a critical damage explosion-y thing mechanic? Can I repair it? And I guess what of the answers change depending on the game? Like, is it a game about many small people versus one very, very large machine? And how does that change what's going on here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's questions about where modeling damage relates to lowering the capabilities of a player, where it leads to being a fun drain, how important it is as simulation, and how much as a games design concern does it sort of lead to snowballing.
So I think there's one or two like classic places that I go when I'm thinking about modeling damage. And this is probably just because of my heritage. So one is Man of War, which has these templates where you have literal boxes that you tick, and you have like areas where you can put like flame tokens and stuff. And the ship gets gets slower once you've had your mast destroyed. Then clearly it can't travel as fast because it can't collect as much of that juicy wind. And so people with oars just like negate an entire section of that. But like for me, the sort of Man of War damage system is a really great crystallization of a couple of like classic assumptions about miniature game design, which is number one, it matters where the damage lands on the model. Number two is if something gets damaged, then it should degrade in its capabilities. I think the first one is obvious. Like for a game that is about the detailed operation of a small number of miniatures, of course, we can be interested in the component parts of those miniatures, because essentially you're looking at what's the sort of mental capacity as a player that I have to manage. And also, like, do I have enough stuff, enough resources to balance to make this an interesting decision? And I think what's intriguing, and actually there was a really nice article in White Dwarf magazine last month from one of them, or a couple of months ago, from one of the designers on the team there, about the rule of 7, which is that humans can roughly retain in their short-term memory 7 plus or minus 2 things. And it got me thinking about the fact that actually when you array a set of stuff, your army out on the table, whether it's a skirmish game or an army game, it actually often ends up being about the same number of elements, even though one of those elements is 1 dude versus 40 dudes. Like, you actually only have the same amount of stuff. So if you've only got 2 or 3 or 4 elements on the table, I think it's absolutely fine for those to then have sub elements, have different locations on which damage can happen and things need to be futzed around with. So I think that's the first thing to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the simplest and in many ways most obvious ways of modeling damage, and it's immense, so I think so elegant that we often just forget about it, is that if you've got a unit of minis like in Warhammer, it takes damage and you pull a mini off and you move out of the way. And it's incredibly simple. That is modeling damage.
I thought that's where you were going. It's like the simplest way is when someone gets hurt, you pull their arm off the model and you super glue it on later.
There's definitely an opportunity for doing that with magnets and, you know, particularly large minis. But yeah, basically, if you think of a unit in a game like Warhammer, it takes a wound, you take a model off, it degrades its capabilities, it lowers its static combat resolution or its number of attacks it has, and it's incredibly elegant. You pick up a model and then you want to know how many wounds that unit has left, you count the number of models in it. And I think, yeah, and then I think you say something like Man of War, where you've got cards that are off the table and allow you to track more specific states. But I do think that there are, with one of the things about a miniatures game is that there are ways of arraying miniatures in ways that you can note a degree of damage taking. It sometimes feels a bit old school, but the ability to lay a miniature down when it's been knocked down, been wounded, been severely wounded, there are ways of noting and modeling damage by using the physical nature of the miniatures we've got on the tabletop, and I think that's something sort of well worth recognizing. I think one thing, something that's there in sort of more cards and counters version war games, but I think I love the version of step damage that they have in HeroClix, which, as I understand, is a patented mechanic by WizKids, which is maybe one of the reasons it hasn't made it into more games. But that has a thing where the bases of the minis have a little dial you turn, and as they lose wounds, it affects all their other statistics. And because that's a superhero game, what's rather lovely about that is for example, Hulk loses wounds, all his stats go up, as opposed to other people, when they lose wounds, their stats go down. And depending on the particular, and it's very elegant because it means there's a whole bunch of rules contained within that set of little turning dials.
Yeah, a bunch of nonsense math that no one wants to do at the table.
Yeah, you could just read the stats off. But I do think for the rest of us, there is something simpler available there in, I don't know if you know, step damage in war games is where you'll either have a token that has, say, 4 sides, or sometimes a cube, and when you get injured, you spin the token or you flip the cube, and it reveals a different set of numbers.
Well, and even just the way that they do it in Age of Sigmar, which is there's a little table that says if you have 0 to 20 to 15 wounds remaining, these are your stats, and blah blah blah, and these are your stats, and blah blah blah, and these are your stats.
I literally have written down HeroClix plus Age of Sigmar. Yeah, so it's
nice. Hitting the notes there.
yeah.
So yeah, and I guess there's an element of this which is how much are you, this has the risk of spinning off into a separate conversation, so I'm going to nix it pretty quickly, but this also goes to a question of how much are you throwing out a problem of recording game state and just saying to the players, up to you, I don't mind. If you have tiny d6s, use those. If you have d10s, use those. If you have wound counters, use those. I don't care. It's nothing to do with me. Versus providing some specific user interface for that, providing the ticky boxes in BattleTech mech outlines, or the Gaslands check boxes for damage. And I think that's a very aesthetic decision. I'm not going to chastise you for choosing either one of those routes. It's just something to be aware of.
I mean, yeah, in relation to that, I think that particularly damage modeling, you want to look at four things. I'm going to say you want it to be elegant, consistent, and a question where it's simulationist and where it remains interesting. Because all damage modeling is going to have a simulationist element, and you've got to ask questions. And at some point, we're going to have a conversation about granularity in your game and the level of granularity you want. But you've got to have a conversation about where you want it to be simulationist and where you want it to be elegant. Because obviously, if you're entering into a situation where damage is occurring, there are many parts on your body that damage can occur to them. And wherever each part occurs will drastically change what you can and can't do.
Yes, I've played RuneQuest 2nd edition.
Yeah, and where you want to go, okay, full simulationist is every piece of shrapnel that is incoming has to be mapped to a particular joint or flesh.
Well, and also simulationist is I got shot by a gun quite close, I'm dead, which is, in a skirmish game where you want all the miniatures to have 8 wounds, like it doesn't really work so well.
Yeah, and again, and there's that thing of the granularity of, okay, you've been shot by a gun, so you're lying on the ground screaming. How do your friends react to that? Do they get to pull you over and patch you up? Are they
Yeah.
horrified at your
How wet are your trousers? Yeah.
yeah. So you have to make a decision about where you're going for simulationism and where you're going for sort of elegance and simplicity, and how fast do you want your game to play? How much how zoomed in is your game in relation to these things? And then I think, yeah, you have to ask a question about, is like you say, if you get hit by a gun at close range, you're dead. That's not a particularly interesting exchange or puzzle for your players to engage with.
Unless you're dealing with a big army game, in which case, like, crack on, tidy up the casualties.
Yeah. Well, if one of your 50
to your
guys,
previous point,
yeah, if one of your 50 guys are dead, hey ho, life is cheap. If your one guy is dead, well, maybe I want a less simulationist and more interesting result of him getting shot. Does he get upset? Does he become enraged? Does he go into a berserker fury? And actually, the more times he gets hit, the more powerful he becomes. Yeah, and so I think you need to try and keep those concerns level. You have to make sure that the way that a player deals with damage in various parts of the game is relatively consistent. Because sometimes some rules go, okay, well, if you get damage, if this thing gets damaged here, it acts in this way. If this thing gets damaged there, it acts in a completely different way. If this thing gets damaged, and you end up with sort of 50 different competing modeling damage systems. And I think that just ends up being a hell of looking through books and tables and rule systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that one in general for most systems in miniature war games.
I think the thing is that sometimes modeling damage gives you fewer rewards, maybe, than other systems, in my opinion. I think.
Well, there's an element that, like, it feels instinctively like it should be a place for emergent narrative and probably for emergent gameplay as well, where it's like, okay, I blew the tank's left track off, that means it can only turn in a certain way, or I like shot your leg off, that like means you fall over and you can only crawl, or something. Like, it feels like those should be places where something cinematic happens and the game state changes and now there's a different set of. But in my experience, that isn't actually a good place to build that stuff in, because ultimately what's happening is, like, that's a moment where something gets more rubbish and has fewer options and is much less exciting and spectacular on the table. And so when it comes to degradation as a mechanic, I went through a whole cycle on the design of A Billion Suns where it felt obvious to me that as you get shot, you're collecting damage tokens, and those damage tokens represent pieces of the ships getting blown up, and they probably very much represent the increasing panic and disorder of the crew as they're rushing about, closing bolt holds and trying to fix engines. And of course that's going to degrade your ship's performance or its ability to carry out its orders. That all seems just right. Of course that's the way that the game works. And I don't know, it just ended up being like, well, as soon as you start taking damage, those ships, those models just become less and less interesting and more disappointing. And their ability to make a Hail Mary final, risk everything attack or something, like I had just designed it in a way where they'd lost too much capability in the game to have any real meaning anymore, as opposed to where it ended up with, which is actually damage does something else. It accelerates the end. So the more damage you've taken, the more possible it is that you'll take critical effects to take more damage and therefore explode sooner, but that your actual fighting capability never decreases, so that even as you're getting towards your almost certain doom, you're still as amazing and cinematic as you were. And in my head, that's because although you may have fewer resources, you're more desperate, you're more fired up, the adrenaline's pumping, that ship is still desperately in the fight, and it's not limping away from combat. It's like, no, even if we have to ram our ship into this other guy, like, we're going to make this count and we're going to fight till the end. And that just tells a much more exciting story, both narratively and in terms of the decisions that I have on the table. So I think my experience with designing the alternative in in A Billion Suns is really think critically about degradation systems in a miniature war game.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. I think in a more overarching idea, possibly, as we've mentioned before, one of the things about tabletop miniatures games is that you don't have laddering. What you have is something more like a zeroing or an acceleration towards an endpoint. And degradation mechanics don't accelerate the game towards an endpoint. They slow it down. They are part of the game ending with a whimper rather than a bang.
Yeah, 100%.
And if you are going to be putting degradation mechanics into a game, things where as things get hurt, they get worse. You want it to be because there are I think, very specific simulationist narrative concerns that you've got in your game. If you want there to be a moment where somebody is crawling, inch by inch across the tabletop, bleeding out, that has you have to really pay up what they're trying to get to do, what the reason for it is, and what the cinematic moment is, because that's just not fun. It's just not fun inherently having a model that you have to activate and then move an inch and that's what you did with it every turn. That's a null turn for a player, unless he's crawling towards the dynamite and he's gonna, or he's crawling towards safety as somebody's coming in to finish him off. You have to build a narrative to it that makes the potentially null activation exciting and interesting.
Make it mean something.
Yeah, because as you take away my tools to do stuff with a given model, there comes a point where you've taken and that will arise, where you've taken away all the fun things I want to do with it, and so you've got to give me something.
Yeah, and I'm left just with the time sink of having to administrate this pointless model.
Yeah,
which is why it's better for it to just have been removed from play, because that is now accelerating.
Exactly. And if you're not going to accelerate towards the climax, and if you are going to make me sink time into it, there has to be some reason it's cinematically interesting when I activate it. I think in relation to granularity and damage modeling, I think this is one of the issues, is that when you're asking people to learn a bunch of rules, you're taking up their sort of cognitive overhead, and you're making them put in physical time of simulating it on the tabletop, and the thing that you are simulating is their stuff getting more garbage. That's a difficult sell to players. It's difficult, if I'm reading a set of rules, I want to remember how to be cool and blow you up, and I want to remember how to run around to get stuff done. I don't particularly want to remember how it is that I bleed out on a garbage heap.
I'm put in mind of like Die Hard or stuff like that, where it's like, he loses his shoes and he's walking on glass, and like it's not affecting the amount of dudes he can kill. Like it just makes him kill more. He's angry now. Like that's for me what you want. That's what damage should do. It should make you more like a semi-nude Bruce Willis.
And don't get me wrong. If you're creating something that is going to go into extreme detail about exactly which rib got broken and how it hurts and how it feels for that person and how they're acting because of it. Oh, he's leaning over this way, so he tends towards the right when he's running or something. Lovely, but understand the costs that you're putting on your players when you do that. Understand that you're costing them in return for taking something away from them, and so you've got to pay them back double. You're making them learn something, and you're making their stuff less cool. So you've got to really pay out on that. They've got to go, yeah, he's got a broken rib, but he's so tough, and he's gonna get. You've got to make something happen for them because of that.
Now, I think just to come to probably the last part of this, which is once you've taken damage, it might not be the last part if we need to talk about criticals, but once you've taken damage, can you repair it? Can you heal? Can you repair? I think this is another thing that I find is an area to be really cautious about. And the reason for that is that if you made me go through the act of taking this damage, like, is it fun for me to then reset the game state a couple of clicks back in order to replay that degradate, that like loss of wounds? Is there a really good payoff for the extension of the game length that repair or heal mechanics ultimately deliver? And I think there are in some cases. So like a heal spell in Frostgrave is a really interesting tactical choice. Like, it's quite, you're using one of your very limited casts, you might not get it off, but you've decided to do that instead of something else. And so I've had an interesting decision, which is like, I need this guy to escape with the loot, so I'm going to, instead of zapping that, I'm going to heal this. Like, that's an interesting decision. But if like your default mechanic is we're all we're all vessels on the sea, and I can roll a bunch of crew members to try and put fires out and re-rig sails and stuff, like potentially that's answering the question of like, why is a degraded ship still fun later in the turn? But I would question why you bothered degrading it and making me do a repair roll rather than just making me continue to have fun uninterrupted with that ship. And so I think that, used injudiciously, I think repair rolls are just an extension to the game duration without any particular fun going on. I think there's a couple of ways of doing almost repairs that are nice, which is like, if you have I wanted to describe it as a sort of ratchet system, but I think it's more like two resources, one of which permanently drains down and one of which can be refreshed. So in something like Adeptus Titanicus, like, you can there's a number of Adeptus Titanicus is extremely detailed because you're only really dealing with 2 or 3 models, but like, there's a damage track that you can never repair, there's a reactor heat thing that you can vent heat from, and then there's a critical damage track on each location that, like, I think you can repair, but you can only repair it in a certain way. So like, in that situation, you've got a sort of situational or partial repair thing where like you create moments where like there's a nail biting, like, if I just get this repair roll, then I get one more activation and I get to shoot all my cool stuff at you and maybe change the course of the game. But I'm never going to just go back to full health because some of these are permanent non-recoverable resources. And I think balancing the different resources is definitely worth considering, so that you can provide some sort of undulation without ever providing the ability to completely reset the game state.
Yeah, it's sort of, what fungibility does do the results of your damage have? If I take off a wound from you, wounds are wounds and they can't be spent for anything else. If you can heal, a heal is an action. An action can be used for a lot of things. So if I'm wounding you and you're just healing, I'm not costing you wounds, I'm costing you actions, which are fungible abilities. I could have used an action to shoot you, I could use it to run around, I could use it to heal. If there's
in many systems, wounds are a resource you can spend to fuel abilities or spells. So in some regards, that's like an acceleration, or in some regards, and there's so many things in miniature war games that are like this, that like, that reduces the number of interesting choices that you've got with that model in the back half of the game, which is sucky.
Well, yeah, but like I say, that's the nature of miniatures war games, that they are about this zeroing in on fewer important questions rather than a building up of what you can do. And that I think is something that is important to bear in mind when you're designing, that they have a particular shape, and if you give people healing, you have to give yourself serious questions about how it affects that shape of those games. They are going to be accelerating to an endpoint. That is the nature of one of these games. If you give them healing, how are you affecting that acceleration? Are you changing its shape in an interesting way, or are you just slowing it down? And if you're just slowing it down, reconsider, I think.
So I think like the last thing that I mentioned right at the top of this conversation, which potentially can be covered quite quickly, was like critical damage mechanics. And to describe the classic critical damage mechanic, it is when I roll a 6 or a 10 or something, when I'm making a hit, I go, ooh, critical hit, and I go to my chart and I roll a subsequent dice and I find out, did the engines get blown up, or did, you know, the bridge get destroyed or something? And my feelings on that, as a designer, not necessarily as a player, my feelings on that as a designer are, you made me look in a book to tell me something specific that wasn't emergent, but you told me, and that then probably degraded the ship in some way because it probably has a rule that says -1 command from now on or something. And so those are three things I don't love. You've really distracted me from the game, and you've pulled me into the rule book and blah blah blah. Now, in reality, I actually really like rolling on the critical hit table in Manowar. Like I just do. Maybe it's a well-written critical hit table or something, but I don't think that they are completely without merit. It's just like, in pure game design logic terms, they stink. Don't do them.
I mean, yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I think you are inherently this. I hate all critical hit tables, all of them, just across the board. They disgust me and shouldn't happen. You are, I think, in your heart, the sort of person they appeal to, and you're kind of the reason they exist. I would burn them all on a bonfire.
But it might be situational to a certain kind of game can get away with it. And I think, you know, being Manowar and being from the 90s, like, you know, I think like when I looked at Drop Fleet Commander, like I was really disappointed to see that Andy Chambers had put a critical hit table in there, and felt like, you know, Andy, that's a little bit old school. Like I know there's a lot of things from kind of previous games that you're sort of bringing in here, but that felt like a real clang of like there's so many modern ideas in this game, and yet I have to look up a table. Really, that's ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole separate conversation, I think, about like how you kind of model that sort of more detailed stuff in it, but I don't think we should have that conversation now. I think the point with critical hits is that they're all the same problem that we've just discussed about degradation, and about how do you provide ways to track it and record it.
And I think we have to have a conversation about granularity generally at some point. What granularity means, how it affects your design, etc., etc. The last thing I'm going to say, and I'm just going to leave.
We do it through different forms of sugar.
Yes, ideally sugar to salt through the sand matrix. The last thing I'm going to say, and I'm just going to leave this one hanging, and it is, you know, does your game need any damage modeling whatsoever? You know, we talked before about, you know, okay, is there an option to have damage just knock people back, and if you're trying to achieve objectives, is just being moved around interesting? Is there a reason to have things hurt, killed, taken off in your game? There might not be. It might not be worth modeling any kind of damage whatsoever. You know, don't assume that you need things to get hurt and taken off and taken away. You know, consider the possibility that, you know, you have a game where everything's going to remain as capable as it always was, and do other interesting things to each other, you know, throughout the game. We'll just leave that as an idea out there, because I think we'll round up this conversation now, and we will say, if you have watched this point, thank you very much for watching. If you have watched this point, I assume that you like what we do and the conversations we have. If you do, please like and subscribe. Drop us a comment in the comment section. What's your favorite bit of damage modeling in a game? How do you feel about critical hit tables? Are they splendid and should be in more games, or awful and should be shot at dawn? You know, how do you like to see damage model? Do you want more granularity? Do you want less? Do you want to see your people limping around the tabletop, or do you want to see them putting out of their misery? Either way, let us know. Look us up on social media, get in contact with us. We always like to hear your opinions, and this is a conversation that came from a comment in the comment section. So, you know, if you have a question, drop it in there. We will read them, I will note them, and we will at some point chat about them. But for now, we'll say from this episode of Rule of Carnage, thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye-bye.